What happens when the most notorious motorcycle club in America goes head-to-head with the world's deadliest drug cartels? Today, we're diving into 10 explosive encounters where the Hells Angels learned the hard way that some battles are better left unfought. Let's kick things off with a story that took place in the scorching deserts of Arizona back in 2009. The Hells Angels had been running a pretty successful operation, distributing methamphetamine across the southwestern United States. They thought they were untouchable. They had their roots, their connections, and their reputation to back them up. But here's the thing about cartels. They don't like competition, especially on their turf. The Sinaloa cartel had been watching the Hells Angels operation for months. These weren't just any drug dealers. The Sinaloa cartel is one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, responsible for smuggling billions of dollars worth of drugs across the border every single year. They have sophisticated networks, corrupt officials on their payroll, and sicarios, professional hitmen who are trained like military operatives. So when the Hells Angels started moving product through Arizona without paying tribute or asking permission, the cartel took it personally. It was a matter of respect, and in the cartel world, disrespect gets you killed. One night, 3 Hells Angels members were driving through a remote desert road, transporting a shipment of meth. They thought they were being careful. They took back roads, traveled at night, and kept their phones off. But the cartel had eyes everywhere. Suddenly, their truck was lit up by headlights from multiple vehicles. Before they could react, gunfire erupted from all sides. It was an ambush. Professional, calculated, and deadly. The cartel members used military-grade weapons, AK-47s and AR-15. The bikers didn't stand a chance. When authorities found the truck the next morning, it looked like a war zone. The message was clear. This is our territory. Stay out or pay the price. The Hells Angels lost 3 members that night, and the shipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was gone. It was a brutal reminder that being tough on the streets of California doesn't mean much when you're dealing with international drug cartels. Moving on to story number 2, we're heading south of the border to Tijuana, Mexico. Now, Tijuana has always been a hotspot for criminal activity. It's right on the border with California, making it the perfect gateway for drug smuggling. The Tijuana cartel controlled this city with an iron fist for decades. In the early 2000s, some Hells Angels members thought they could establish direct connections with suppliers in Mexico, cutting out the middlemen and increasing their profits. On paper, it seemed like a smart business move. Go straight to the source, build relationships, and maximize earnings. So a group of senior members from the San Diego chapter made the trip down to Tijuana. They met with some cartel associates at a nightclub, a place where business deals happened away from prying eyes. The meeting seemed to go well. There was drinking, music, and talk of a lucrative partnership. But what the Hells Angels didn't know was that they were walking into a trap. The cartel had no intention of partnering with them. They saw the bikers as potential competitors who might try to establish their own distribution networks. In the cartel's eyes, it was better to eliminate the threat before it became a problem. As the night went on, the Hells Angels members were led to a back room under the pretense of finalizing the deal. That's when everything went south. Cartel enforcers were waiting. The bikers were beaten, robbed, and held for ransom. The cartel demanded $1 million for their safe return. The Hells Angels leadership faced a terrible choice: pay the ransom or let their brothers die. After days of tense negotiations, they paid up. The captured members were released, but they were warned in the most brutal terms imaginable. They were told that if any Hells Angels ever tried to operate in Tijuana again, there would be no ransom, just bodies. This incident taught the club a harsh lesson about international criminal politics. The cartels operate on a completely different level, with different rules and far more resources. Now we're heading north to Canada for story number 3, and this one involves betrayal, greed, and a partnership that ended in tragedy. British Columbia has long been a major hub for drug trafficking, particularly for marijuana and cocaine coming from South America. The Hells Angels had a strong presence there, controlling much of the drug trade in Vancouver and surrounding areas. They were powerful, organized, and profitable. In 2005, a Hells Angels member named Rick began working with Colombian cocaine suppliers. The arrangement was simple. The Colombians would provide high-quality cocaine, and Rick would distribute it through the Hells Angels network. Both sides made enormous profits. But Rick got greedy. Instead of sharing the profits equally with his club, he started skimming money off the top. He figured no one would notice because the operation was so successful. He was wrong. The Colombians noticed first. They kept meticulous records of every shipment, every transaction. When their numbers didn't match up with what Rick was reporting, they became suspicious. They started investigating, and they discovered that Rick was stealing from both them and his own club. Here's where it gets really dark. The Colombians didn't confront Rick directly. Instead, they went to the Hells Angels leadership and presented evidence of the theft. They gave the club an ultimatum: deal with Rick yourselves, or we will, and it won't be pretty. The Hells Angels were furious. Not only had Rick stolen from them, but his actions had put the entire organization at risk. In the criminal underworld, your reputation is everything. If word got out that they couldn't control their own members, they would look weak. What happened next is still murky, but Rick disappeared. His body was never found. The official story was that he fled the country, but people close to the situation say otherwise. The Colombians got their message across: don't steal from us and keep your house in order. This incident showed that even within powerful criminal organizations, loyalty only goes so far. When money and reputation are on the line, anyone can become expendable. Story number 4 takes us back to the southwestern United States, where control of smuggling routes is literally a matter of life and death. By 2012, the Hells Angels had established several successful methamphetamine labs in rural California. Their product was good, their distribution network was solid, and they were making serious money. But they needed a reliable way to get precursor chemicals from Mexico, the ingredients used to make meth. They reached out to a smaller Mexican trafficking organization, thinking they could establish a mutually beneficial relationship. For a while, it worked. The chemicals came across the border, the meth got made, and everyone got paid. But then the Jalisco New Generation Cartel entered the picture. If you don't know about CJNG, they're one of the newest but most violent cartels in Mexico. They're known for their military-style tactics, their use of drones and heavy weaponry, and their willingness to challenge even the biggest cartels. CJNG decided they wanted control of that smuggling pipeline. They approached the smaller organization that was supplying the Hells Angels and gave them a choice: work for us or die. The smaller organization, knowing they couldn't fight CJNG, agreed. Suddenly, the Hells Angels found their supply chain disrupted. Shipments stopped coming, prices skyrocketed. When they tried to negotiate, CJNG made it clear that from now on, things would work on their terms. They tripled the price and demanded a bigger cut of the profits. The Hells Angels tried to push back. They sent representatives to meet with CJNG leaders, hoping to renegotiate. Those representatives came back with a video message on their phones. The video showed what CJNG did to people who didn't cooperate. It was graphic, brutal, and effective. The Hells Angels had no choice but to accept the new terms. They lost millions in potential profits, and their meth operation became far less profitable. Some chapters had to shut down their labs entirely because the economics no longer made sense. Let's head to Las Vegas for story number 5. Sin City isn't just about casinos and shows. It's also a major distribution hub for drugs coming from Mexico. In 2008, both the Hells Angels and the Sinaloa cartel wanted a bigger piece of the Vegas market. The Hells Angels had been distributing cocaine and methamphetamine in Las Vegas for years. They had connections with casino workers, club promoters, and high rollers. Their operation was sophisticated and profitable, but the Sinaloa cartel wanted direct access to this lucrative market. Why sell wholesale to the Hells Angels when they could distribute directly and keep all the profits? So they started sending their own people into Vegas, establishing distribution networks that competed directly with the bikers. Tensions escalated quickly. There were confrontations in nightclubs, disputes over territories, and several violent incidents that caught the attention of law enforcement. The Hells Angels felt disrespected. This was their city, their territory, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. Things came to a head outside a popular nightclub on the Strip. A group of Hells Angels confronted suspected cartel distributors. Words were exchanged, then threats, and finally, gunfire. In the middle of the Las Vegas Strip, with tourists everywhere, a shootout erupted. Miraculously, no tourists were killed, but several people were injured. The police response was massive. Both organizations found themselves under intense scrutiny from federal law enforcement. The DEA, FBI, and local police all launched investigations. Here's the thing about violence in public places. It's bad for business. Cartels prefer to operate in the shadows. They don't want media attention or federal heat. The Sinaloa cartel's leadership was furious that their Vegas operation had drawn so much attention. A meeting was arranged through intermediaries. Both sides agreed to a truce, not out of respect or friendship, but because continued conflict was hurting everyone's profits. The Hells Angels would maintain control of certain territories and customer bases, while the cartel would operate in other areas. It was a cold business decision, but it worked. The violence stopped, and both organizations went back to making money. Sometimes in the criminal underworld, the enemy of your enemy isn't your friend. Sometimes your enemy becomes your business partner because it's simply more profitable that way. Story number 6 is one of the darkest on this list. It took place in Riverside, California, in 2011, and it serves as a brutal reminder of what happens when territorial disputes get out of control. The Hells Angels had a clubhouse in Riverside, a place where members gathered, held meetings, and conducted business. It was their sanctuary, their headquarters in Southern California. Everyone in the area knew about it, including the cartels. A splinter group from the Arellano Felix organization, also known as the Tijuana cartel, had been trying to establish a foothold in the Riverside area. They were distributing heroin and cocaine, slowly building up their customer base and networks. The Hells Angels saw this as a direct challenge to their authority. They had controlled drug distribution in that area for decades, and they weren't about to let some cartel waltz in and take over. They started targeting the cartel's street-level dealers, roughing them up and warning them to leave town. The cartel's response was swift and terrifying. One night, a group of sicarios drove up to the Hells Angels clubhouse. These weren't just thugs with guns. These were trained killers with military experience. They opened fire on the clubhouse with automatic weapons, unleashing hundreds of rounds in just a few minutes. 4 Hells Angels members were killed, and several others were seriously wounded. The clubhouse was riddled with bullets, turned into something that looked like a war zone. By the time police arrived, the shooters were long gone, having escaped across the border into Mexico. The Hells Angels were devastated. They had lost brothers, and their reputation as an untouchable organization took a serious hit. They wanted revenge, but how do you retaliate against an organization that operates from another country, with resources and manpower far beyond what a motorcycle club can muster? Federal law enforcement got involved, launching a massive investigation. Several arrests were made on both sides, and eventually, some of the shooters were identified and captured. But the damage was done. The Riverside massacre became a turning point, showing that the old rules of engagement no longer applied. Cartels weren't interested in fair fights or street codes. They were interested in eliminating threats efficiently and moving on with business. Story number 7 involves something that both the Hells Angels and cartels hate more than each other: snitches. In 2013, federal authorities managed to flip a Hells Angels member who had been working closely with Gulf Cartel distributors. Let's call him Danny. Danny was a full-patch member who had connections on both sides of the border. He was making a fortune facilitating drug shipments from Mexico to various Hells Angels chapters throughout the Southwest. He was trusted by both organizations, considered reliable and professional. But Danny got busted. Federal agents caught him with a massive shipment of cocaine, enough to put him away for decades. Facing life in prison, Danny made a choice that would have been unthinkable for most Hells Angels members. He agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. For months, Danny wore a wire to meetings with both Hells Angels leadership and cartel representatives. He gathered evidence, recorded conversations, and helped federal agents build cases against dozens of high-ranking criminals on both sides. When the indictments came down, it was like a bomb going off in the criminal underworld. Dozens of Hells Angels members and cartel operatives were arrested simultaneously in coordinated raids across multiple states. The organization and trust that had taken years to build came crashing down overnight. Both the Hells Angels and the Gulf Cartel put out contracts on Danny's life. In the criminal world, there's no greater sin than becoming an informant. Danny entered witness protection, but the price on his head remains. To this day, both organizations are actively looking for him. For story number 8, we're going back to Canada, but this time we're talking about a conflict that most people have never heard about because it was resolved quietly, behind closed doors. In 2014, the Hells Angels had a lucrative operation bringing cocaine from Mexican cartels through the United States and into Canada. The markup was enormous. Cocaine that cost $30,000 per kilo in Mexico could sell for $60,000 or more in Canadian cities. The operation ran smoothly for years, generating tens of millions of dollars in profits. But then, the Hells Angels made a critical mistake. They started cutting the product, diluting the cocaine to increase their profit margins. They figured no one would notice if they reduced the purity by 10 or 15%. The Sinaloa cartel noticed. They had quality control measures in place, with chemists testing the product at various points in the supply chain. When their Canadian customers started complaining about lower quality cocaine, the cartel investigated and traced the problem back to the Hells Angels. What happened next was a masterclass in cartel diplomacy and intimidation. The cartel didn't immediately retaliate with violence. Instead, they sent representatives to meet with Hells Angels leadership in Canada. These weren't low-level soldiers. These were high-ranking cartel members who flew in specifically for this meeting. The message was clear and non-negotiable. Stop cutting our product, or we'll find someone else to work with. And just to make sure the message was understood, they showed evidence that they had already begun building alternative distribution networks in Canada. They could cut the Hells Angels out entirely if they wanted to. The Hells Angels were in a tough spot. If they lost this pipeline, they would lose millions in annual revenue. After tense negotiations, they agreed to the cartel's terms. No more cutting the product, and they would accept a reduced profit margin as punishment for their attempted deception. Story number 9 takes us back to Arizona for a confrontation that almost sparked a full-scale war between the Hells Angels and the Sinaloa cartel. In 2016, a Hells Angels member named Jake was running a successful meth operation in Phoenix. He had his own cooks, his own distribution network, and he was making serious money. But he was buying precursor chemicals from a source connected to the Sinaloa cartel. Jake decided he wanted to cut out the middleman and deal directly with the cartel's suppliers in Mexico. He made contact with a cartel lieutenant and proposed a new arrangement. The lieutenant seemed interested and invited Jake to a meeting in Nogales, a border town in Arizona. Jake should have known better. You don't just walk into a meeting with cartel members without proper introductions and safeguards. But greed made him careless. He drove to Nogales with only one other club member for backup. At the meeting location, a seemingly abandoned warehouse, Jake and his associate were immediately surrounded by armed cartel members. They were disarmed, zip-tied, and thrown into the back of a van. They were being kidnapped. But here's where things get interesting. The Hells Angels have a rule. You mess with one member, you mess with the entire club. When Jake didn't return, the Hells Angels mobilized. They contacted every resource they had, including corrupt law enforcement officials, private investigators, and their own network of criminal contacts. Within hours, they had tracked Jake to a location just south of the border. The Hells Angels then did something unprecedented. They contacted the cartel leadership directly through a series of intermediaries and made their own threat. Release our members, or we'll create problems you don't want. What kind of problems? The Hells Angels threatened to start targeting cartel distribution networks in California, attacking their street-level dealers and generally causing chaos that would hurt the cartel's business and attract law enforcement attention. The cartel leadership had to make a calculation. Was it worth starting a war over two bikers who had overstepped? Would the disruption to their California operations cost more than whatever they might gain from killing these two? After tense negotiations that lasted almost 48 hours, a deal was reached. Jake and his associate were released, but they had to pay $500,000 and agree never to attempt direct contact with cartel suppliers again. The Hells Angels paid the ransom, glad to have their members back alive. For our final story, let's talk about where things stand today. The relationship between the Hells Angels and Mexican cartels has evolved into what can only be described as an uneasy peace, a business arrangement based on mutual profit rather than respect or loyalty. In recent years, both sides have realized that constant conflict is bad for business. Law enforcement loves nothing more than violence between criminal organizations. It gives them justification for increased resources, wiretaps, investigations, and prosecutions. Every public shooting or gang war brings unwanted attention that disrupts profitable operations. So today, in most regions, there are informal agreements. The Hells Angels stick to certain types of drugs and territories, primarily meth distribution in areas where they have established networks. The cartels focus on cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl, using the Hells Angels as one of many distribution networks rather than competing with them directly. But make no mistake, this peace is fragile. It's maintained by older, more pragmatic leaders on both sides who understand that cooperation is more profitable than conflict. As new, younger members rise through the ranks, there's always the risk that someone will test boundaries, disrespect the wrong person, or make a power play that reignites hostilities. There are still occasional flare-ups. A Hells Angels member gets robbed by someone connected to a cartel. A cartel distributor gets beaten up in territory controlled by the bikers. But compared to the bloody conflicts of the 2000s and early 2010s, things are relatively calm. Law enforcement officials say this peace won't last forever. The nature of criminal organizations is that they're always looking to expand, to take over new territories, and to maximize profits. Eventually, economic interests will clash again, and when they do, the violence will return. For now, both the Hells Angels and the cartels are making too much money to risk everything on pride or territorial disputes. But in the criminal underworld, peace is always temporary. It's just a matter of time before someone messes with the wrong organization and the cycle of violence begins again. What do you think? Should law enforcement do more to crack down on these organizations, or is the current strategy of letting them fight amongst themselves while gathering intelligence the smarter approach? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We've got tons more content about the criminal underworld, true crime stories, and the fascinating dark side of society that most people never see.